Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited for my final 2023 NBA mock draft, and to celebrate it's going to be a full 2-round mock draft. We're going to make all 58 selections in this year's draft. Yes, that's right, only 58 picks. There's not 60 this year. We'll talk about that when we get there in the second round. But I'm super excited and I'm super thankful as well to each and every one of you that have supported the journey through the 2023 NBA draft process. Just so you know, I'm already in the works for 2024 as well. So there's going to be a lot more content coming out even after this year's draft. I'll also be covering free agency, and just a little bit of a heads up, I'm going to be live on the channel the day before the NBA draft and the day of. I will be reacting to comments, just kind of chatting with you guys about what to expect, things that we could see happen, and just having a lot of fun kind of basking in the final little bit of the 2023 NBA draft. I really hope you guys do enjoy today's video. If you do, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like what you saw in this video. And without further ado, let's jump into the first overall pick, where the San Antonio Spurs are on the clock. And I think we all know where we're going with this mock draft. It's been the easiest first overall selection arguably ever. There's not been a lot of controversy about who should go first overall this year. Of course, Victor Wembanyama from Metropolitans 92 will be the first overall pick by the San Antonio Spurs. And the franchise that drafted David Robinson, Tim Duncan, they now add in another generational big man with extreme touch, massive size and length, one of the best prospects I'll ever have the opportunity of watching and evaluating. I'm just so glad that he was a part of this process and that we got to spend this year talking about him amidst all of these other prospects. He's so special. And just for an early expectation from what I'm kind of expecting from him next year, I'm looking at a guy who's going to score over 20 points a game for sure. That's a guarantee. My expectation is he's closer to 24, 25-ish points per game. I think he could be an all-star as a rookie. He's going to average over 2.5 blocks a game as a rookie. And the big question is, how does he stay healthy and what does that look like? My guess is he does miss some games like any other NBA player. And here's the thing, if he has like a sprained ankle or something, you guys have to not hit the panic button right away on Victor Wembanyama. Players get hurt all the time. Players miss time for sprained ankles and, sore muscles, those kinds of things. Be patient on him. Don't hit the panic button if he gets hurt early in his career. As long as it's nothing too serious or crazy, just pump the brakes a little bit on any concerns you have, because I think talent-wise, this guy's right up there with some of the best who have ever done it as a prospect. And I think we're going to see a lot of really great basketball in San Antonio, as the Spurs have multiple second-round picks as well to come back and kind of add to this selection in Victor Wembanyama. Now the second overall pick, perhaps the most discussed pick of all time, I would say. The Charlotte Hornets have been at the center of NBA discussion since earning the second overall pick through the 2023 NBA Draft Lottery. And I haven't switched up on who I actually expect to be the second overall pick. Scoot Henderson will be the selection out of G League Ignite. The Hornets, they're in a spot where they need more talent. LaMelo Ball has yet to play in a playoff game, and you can't just sit here and say, oh, we're worried about fit. No, you have to be worried about adding talent, and quite frankly, Scoot Henderson is the second most talented prospect in this year's class. One of the few concerns you can have about him is his 6'2" height as a guard. Doesn't scream a lot of versatility, but when you consider the fact that he has a 6'9" wingspan to offer, he's extremely athletic and somebody who probably projects to be a solid defensive playmaker. I don't think he'll ever be a stopper, but somebody who could grow into being at least a plus defender, especially in the right situations, right circumstances. I think that the Charlotte Hornets, their attention needs to be on Scoot Henderson, and my expectation is that it will be, given the fact that he had a significantly better workout the first time around with the Charlotte Hornets than Brandon Miller. They brought both of them back in for a second workout, and with Brandon Miller kind of on the rehab process from mononucleosis, I think that all signs point to the Charlotte Hornets selecting Scoot Henderson second overall in the 2023 NBA draft, and I think it's a home run selection for them. I think he fits with LaMelo Ball significantly better than everyone else seems to think. And just a reminder, when James Harden and Chris Paul were teammates for the first year, they won 60 plus games, and they were a game away from making it to the NBA Finals and beating the Kevin Durant Warriors. And if Chris Paul didn't pull his hamstring, maybe they would have done it. Fit sometimes having great talent helps everything mesh anyway. That's what the Hornets need to prefer in this spot in the draft. Now moving on to pick 3, and if pick 2 wasn't super talked about, then pick 3 has been as well in trade discussions specifically. And my current understanding of the situation is the Blazers haven't received any offers that they actually would strongly consider for the 3rd overall pick, but I do believe that there is some hope and maybe even some anticipation that offers for the 3rd overall selection could ramp up within the next couple of days. Now, I've been saying it for weeks on the channel. I don't believe this pick will ultimately get traded. I think the Blazers would love for a great offer to come around, one that they can't say no to, but I don't see that actual offer out there unless Toronto were to really open up the floodgates and send out a lot of talent and some assets back to Portland. But I just don't really see that happening. I think that Toronto plays a little hard to get. I think Portland doesn't mess around, and I think they stay here at pick number 3. So then the question is, which prospect do they draft? I think everyone would say, oh, well, Brandon Miller, he's the guy that fell out of the top 2. Hold on a second. I think that Brandon Miller had a significantly worse workout with the Portland Trailblazers. Now, he did flash some of his shooting. He was getting up and down the court pretty well, but he's very, very light, very slim, and yes, maybe he would be a very good fit next to Damian Lillard. I think you can argue that, but if you look at the Portland Trailblazers front office, specifically Mike Schmitz, who, in my opinion, is the leader of their drafts. I think he's the guy who is going to make the decisions there on draft night. And to me, Mike Schmitz, his relationship with Amen Thompson, he has sat down for interviews with him in the past during his time at ESPN. He has watched him very closely for a long time, has always looked at him as a likely top pick in this year's draft. He understands the athleticism. They had him in the building and they were wowed by his athleticism. This is a little bit against the grain, and this is the one spot in the draft where I feel I'm risking it all. I'm putting Amen Thompson 3rd overall to the Portland Trailblazers because I firmly believe that's the direction that they're going to go. Now, is it possible I end up being wrong about this selection? Yes, but I think everyone currently is trying to pencil in the idea of Brandon Miller 3rd overall to the Portland Trailblazers, and I have a little bit of that Jabari Smith vibe from last year where everyone assumed Jabari Smith was going 1st overall. Even Adrian Wojnarowski reported that was the expectation, and then there was a huge flip. Paolo Banchero last minute becomes the number 1 overall selection, and then Banchero, or after going number 1, we see Holmgren still go 2nd and Jabari Smith go 3rd. So that's kind of what I'm seeing here with Brandon Miller sliding from not even 2 to 3, but also 2 to 3 to 4, where we have the Houston Rockets now on the clock. And for them, this becomes a really good opportunity to add some really good talent, specifically perimeter shot making. The Rockets finished in the bottom 10 last year in 3-point percentage, and they have an opportunity to add another lengthy, tall wing who can shoot from the perimeter in Brandon Miller. They'll have a really intriguing wing duo around Jabari Smith and Brandon Miller, 2 guys who can guard both forward spots. They can also knock down perimeter jump shots. Miller a little bit more creative with a live handle than Jabari Smith. And I think really for Houston here, I know there's some reports on Cam Whitmore. Obviously, Amen Thompson would be their selection had Brandon Miller been off the board at this spot. That's the one, again, concern I have about my mock currently. I have a feeling that Amen Thompson goes 3rd. I feel pretty strongly about that. But if Brandon Miller were to go 3rd, then we would see Amen Thompson go 4th to Houston. I think those 2 guys are somewhat interchangeable. I think the Blazers prefer the fit of Brandon Miller, but prefer the upside and the talent of Amen Thompson. So I think that's going to be a big thing to watch. But the Rockets 4th overall, with this selection, they really can't go wrong either way. I think Amen Thompson's a great fit in terms of the playmaking skill set that he's going to provide to them. I think they need a guy in that building who can be a lead ball handler and set other players up. I think Jalen Green's efficiency would skyrocket following the addition of a really good downhill facilitator, someone who's going to put pressure on the rim, open up the floor in different ways than Kevin Porter Jr. does. I think the Rockets would be significantly better with Amen Thompson, but with Brandon Miller here at 4th overall, I still feel like this is a good addition given the fact that they are going to likely sign James Harden this offseason. I have a very strong indication that James Harden will be in Houston this offseason. I'm really leaning that way over his return to Philly. I do believe that Houston is just a good landing spot again for him. I think he wants to be back in that city. And if you could realistically pitch him on the idea of Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, and Brandon Miller kind of as your wing collection of players, plus Tari Eason, plus some other young pieces, of course, Alperen Şengün. There is a pretty intriguing big man who can do a lot of different stuff skill-wise. I think the Rockets become a really tantalizing young core of players who can shoot, they can pass a bit, and I think with Ime Udoka in there, hopefully this team will learn how to defend and really get some stops, and I think this team could be destined for a significant jump forward with the right moves this offseason, plus some extra cap space to boot. Moving on to pick number 5, we have the Detroit Pistons here. And the Pistons are a team that right now I think that they're currently down to 2 prospects. The prospect I see them landing on here, though, given how the board has fallen, is Cam Whitmore out of Villanova. Cam Whitmore, 13 point per game scorer this past year. In my last mock draft, I talked about how that's a little less productive than maybe what the expectations were for him coming into the year, just following how good of a FIBA U19 summer he had with Team USA. He was dominant for them back then, and then Villanova, they play a completely different style, very slow down pace, and because of that his statistical production wasn't great. I think in Detroit you could see him find a whole lot of success. Now Monty Williams does like to play a slow, controlled pace. I do think Cade Cunningham's going to work perfectly with that, but when you naturally have Cam Whitmore, Jaden Ivey, those two guys are going to get up and down the court. I think the Pistons have a really intriguing combination of young perimeter talent, kind of looking at Jaden Ivey as this dynamic slasher with some pretty intriguing deep range that not enough people talk about. Cade Cunningham, of course, kind of a spot scorer, can get to spots and finish in those areas. And then Cam Whitmore, just a physical freak who is going to be an above the rim finisher for them. He has a freakish, quick first step that is going to get him to the rim pretty often. And I think Jalen Duren's really the piece that ties it all together. I love Duren defensively. I think the Pistons are heading in the right direction. Of course, moving down from the best odds all the way down to number 5 was heartbreaking for this franchise. But drafting Cam Whitmore, a player who maybe has Jaylen Brown-esque potential, I think could be a really nice big step forward for this team. Not to mention Monty Williams, how much better he's going to make them as well. I think the Pistons are in a spot to add significant talent this offseason through the draft, and then also continue to just improve naturally in the house. Pick number 6, we move on to the Orlando Magic, and Orlando's a very interesting team to discuss right now. Of course, the need for shooting is massive, so don't worry, I'm not overlooking that, but I do think that there's a lot of other things that they are considering as well. I think that there's a lot of interest in building this really unique defensive team with dynamic switching ability, a lot of length and size. But I've ultimately landed here on Taylor Hendricks out of UCF. We actually stay in state, and the Orlando Magic select UCF forward Taylor Hendricks. And I think for Orlando, this is a really great selection. I'm super high on Taylor Hendricks. I think his talent level is perfect for the NBA, because even if he's not ever going to grow into a primary on-ball creator, I feel like the Magic feel pretty good about what they have in Paolo Banchero. And when I was talking about kind of that dynamic defensive team and unit that can switch and has a bunch of different guys who can guard up and down the lineup, I think Taylor Hendricks fits into that very, very well. He's got pretty good lateral mobility for his size, but he plays very big as well. He's about 6'10" or so in shoes, but I think you could realistically look at him as a guy who impacts the game defensively like a 7-footer at times with his rim protection capabilities. And next to Wendell Carter Jr., who's one of the best contracts in the NBA right now on a descending deal, Orlando's kind of loaded in the front court, and they get even stronger as Taylor Hendricks shoots 39% from 3. It addresses that three-point shooting need a bit. Now, he's not one of those crazy movement shooters who's gonna open up your offense completely, but he's a really good spot-up guy, and I think he's gonna play off of Banchero and Franz Wagner very well. The Magic also with Markelle Fultz, if he can stay healthy, we'll see that team kind of be more so what they were toward the end of the year, which is a really dynamic, kind of young, talented team that I think was catching a lot of people by surprise. You think back to early in the season when they won back-to-back games against the Boston Celtics. Orlando's a pretty intriguing young team, and I think adding Taylor Hendricks, one of my favorite prospects in the draft, is a really good move for them. Moving on to the 7th overall selection, we have the Indiana Pacers on the clock here. And Indiana, a team that I think has a good amount of talent currently existing on the roster, and they find themselves here in this spot selecting the one player that they had out of the 3 guys that they're targeting left on the board, Jarace Walker out of Houston. I know that they like Cam Whitmore. I know that they really like Taylor Hendricks, but I think that they're very content as well with Jarace Walker 7th overall, out of those 3 guys. I feel like they're happy with the result of whoever's on the board for them. And given the fact that this class has Wembanyama, Scoot, Thompson, and Brandon Miller, it's very likely that the Pacers get at least one of their 3 top guys in the draft who could be potentially available for them. I think the Pacers are in a very strong spot to add good talent. Jarace Walker's got really intriguing ball skills as a kind of shot maker and has a live handle that is pretty unique for a 4. I've been on record of calling him a better DeAndre Hunter, who had a pretty nice season this past year for the Atlanta Hawks. And I think the Pacers, a team that has a decent amount of offensive half-court talent. Of course, Halliburton is kind of their engine. And then outside of that, Matherin's a dynamic downhill slasher, and I think the shot making is going to take a big step forward in year 2. Myles Turner, of course, we know what he is, a dynamic big man who can step out behind the three-point line, but also a really good pick-and-roll duo with Tyrese Halliburton and Buddy Hield, one of the best early transition shot makers in the league, and of course, lethal behind the three-point line. You add in now a player who's really strong, can guard up and down the lineup quite a bit. The Pacers finished in the bottom 5 in defensive rating this past year. They need to build a better defense, and it's hard to rely on a rookie to do that. But Jarace Walker has the traits to grow into a very, very good defender. He was playing high-impact, meaningful basketball for the Houston Cougars this past year, and I think the Pacers feel very, very good about this selection, 7th overall. Moving on to pick number 8, now we have the Washington Wizards, who are undergoing a rebuild. Of course, just recently traded Bradley Beal to the Phoenix Suns. The deal is still kind of being finalized and worked out. There's still some missing pieces at the time I'm recording this, but I feel like it was a home run for the Washington Wizards. I know some people are going to disagree with that, saying, well, asset management, they should have traded him 2 years ago. You have to remember, this is a completely new front office. They just hired Michael Winger a week ago, and Will Dawkins, their GM, a week ago. It took them 7 days to trade Bradley Beal, so you can't blame this management for last management's mistakes. And I think Washington, after getting off of Beal, clearing out that contract, and also getting some pick swaps in the door, they're in a pretty strong spot going forward in terms of the asset collection that they have now. And they're headed toward probably a top 3 or 4 pick over the next 2-3 years. So we could see Washington add a lot of young talent, and I think they're going to start that process here now, selecting Ausar Thompson from G League Ignite, or from Overtime Elite, a player who super athletic, and I'm not talking just like college level athleticism or prep school athleticism. I'm talking in the NBA. He is going to flash. You turn on the TV, and he is going to be incredible to watch. And I think for Washington, with kind of the lack of guards right now on their roster, they do have DeLon Wright, Monte Morris. We'll see if either of those 2 guys get routed this offseason somewhere. I think Ausar Thompson, there's always been this question around him of, hey, what does he look like with the ball in his hands? Because his twin brother Amen has taken that role from him when they played together. So does Ausar have the opportunity to be featured in an offense as the primary or at worst secondary ball handler? And I think the answer to that for Washington is probably yes at points throughout the season. Now, I think Denny Avdia is going to play with the ball quite a bit. We'll see what Washington ends up building. I think there's a lot of moves yet to be made. We'll see if Kristaps Porzingis opts in or not. But I think Ausar Thompson, a really good selection for the Washington Wizards, a player that they should feel very comfortable with and confident in selecting because of those physical tools. They're under no pressure right now to be a playoff team as early as next season. It's all about development and long-term patience, and I think the Wizards, they have the right owner for that. Ted Leonsis, I think, is a very patient guy, a very patient owner, and I think Michael Winger is going to be given the space and the opportunity to build this the way he sees fit. And I think Ausar Thompson's a great beginning point, because this team's going to be still bad next year, but Ausar's going to flash a ton of his skills. I think that they're going to give him opportunities to grow, all while being bad and lining themselves up for a chance at maybe a Matas Buzeles in 2024 potentially. Pick number 9, now we move on to the Utah Jazz, and Danny Ainge is smiling ear to ear because this is a player that they had in the building and a player that I am 100% confident he likes a lot, and it's Anthony Black from Arkansas. Anthony Black is such a perfect selection for Danny Ainge because he offers pretty much everything Danny Ainge likes to look for in his typical guard prospects, and that's size, defensive acumen, activity, and just overall being a good player. Danny Ainge has had so many hits throughout his career as a lead decision maker in the NBA, and I think this is going to be his latest example of it, as Anthony Black contributes to a really unique defensive pairing there in Utah of both Black and Walker Kessler. Kessler is super good as a drop coverage big, of course, had a fantastic rookie season for Utah, and now they kind of get this sticky guard who can maneuver screens pretty well, offers a ton of length, and he's just a disruptor on the basketball and off of it. And I think Utah, if you're trying to build something long-term that's pretty cohesive, getting a guy who is really adept at running a pick and roll to kind of match your young rookie center that you just had from a year ago, Anthony Black's one of the best fits in the draft here to Utah at number 9. I feel like it's too low of a selection. I'm significantly higher on Anthony Black myself than the 9th overall selection. I think if I was picking, I would have taken him quite a bit earlier, honestly. But I think his talent level, his IQ, and just his understanding of how to play the game, his feel for the game, are going to go a long way in helping Utah probably surprise some people with how good they could be as early as next season, depending on some of the other moves that they make going forward. Pick number 10, now we have the Dallas Mavericks, and I elected to not trade the asset here for the Dallas Mavericks in this final mock draft. I just could not find a deal that I liked enough to make the trade. So 10th overall, I have the Dallas Mavericks selecting Gradey Dick out of Kansas, and Gradey Dick's a player that I do think is going to have a really nice NBA career. I think he's going to be a perfect off-ball player in a lot of ways because not only is he a three-point shooter, he's a three-point plus shooter. And what I mean by that is he can also take the ball off the deck and get to spots on the floor. He likes to go to his left hand shooting mid-range jump shots off the move, which I think is really good for him attacking closeouts and giving him a little bit more offensive versatility than just being a spot-up guy. I also think he's a surprising cutter. When you actually turn on the film, he's somebody who he utilizes downhill space while he uses his gravity to draw out the defender and then from there work back downhill. He's pretty instinctual as a cutter, and I think off of Kyrie Irving and off of Luka Doncic, you need players who are capable of doing that. Now the Mavericks still have massive flaws on this roster. They need rim protection, they need rebounding, they need size. They have a 2027 first to trade to get those things. We'll see if they're able to do that or not. But 10th overall, I think the Mavericks are in a spot where drafting Gradey Dick, who's I think a day one ready impact guy, he's going to be a really nice addition for them and gives them some length and size on the wing too, at about 6'7", which they currently don't really possess a ton of that. I think it's a massive upgrade for the Mavericks roster, and I feel most confident about him going 10th overall. Moving on to pick 11, we're back to the Orlando Magic. Remember, at 6, we went with Taylor Hendricks out of UCF, and now at 11, I'm tasked with either addressing purely shooting or going with a player who maybe fits that unique defensive identity and offering even more length, size, and athleticism, and that's what I'm going with here. I'm going with that second pathway in Bilal Coulibaly from Metropolitans 92. From a lot of reports, it sounds like he does, in fact, have a lottery promise, and I feel very good about the potential of him being a top 12 pick in this draft. In fact, I would say 12 is maybe his floor in this year's class. And Coulibaly at 11 just makes a lot of sense to me. Look at what Orlando currently possesses. Again, we're talking about that length, size, strength. Coulibaly is a unique and intriguing, dynamic athlete who has extremely long strides. In fact, you could almost call him Baby Giannis with the way that he gets to the rim from half court, occasionally only needing 1 or 2 dribbles to get all the way from half court to the rim. Pretty impressive given the fact that he's a wing and not like a true kind of forward. He's really quick and athletic. If I had to use one word to describe him, it would be slithery. I think it's hard for guys to stick on him. I think he leverages his shoulders well to get downhill. Oh, and by the way, he shot 45% from 3 this past season for the Metropolitans 92. Now, it's on very low volume. He didn't shoot a ton of threes, only shot about 1 a game. So you can't say that he's 100% a good three-point shooter, but you can't say that he hasn't shown that, hey, he's capable of making shots. The real big concern on Bilal Coulibaly is off the dribble shooting. He's got a pretty slow jump shot. He doesn't really strike a lot of fear into people as a pull-up guy. In fact, he only shot 15 dribble pull-ups this year for Metropolitans 92, and he made 1 of them. So he's got some long ways to go in some of these developmental areas, especially off the dribble scoring as a pull-up shooter, but I think that there are some elements that you just have to love. I think he's going to really impress people early on in his career because he just has a lot of length, size, athleticism, and he's functional with them in terms of going downhill, kind of applying pressure to the rim, and just finishing plays in ways that you don't think are possible until all of a sudden you see the ball go in the hoop and you say, wow, did Bilal Coulibaly really just pull that off? And the answer to that is yes. Moving on to pick number 12, we have the Oklahoma City Thunder here. And for OKC, there's a lot of smoke out right now about who they could potentially be targeting. And I think that nobody really has a clear answer on who the Oklahoma City Thunder are going to likely select at pick 12. So for me, I went with a guy that I think fits the mold of what they like, the way that they want to play, even though it doesn't necessarily address some of the needs that they currently actively have on their roster, which is kind of size, rebounding, strength, and functional front court play. This doesn't address this, okay? But 12th overall, I have the Oklahoma City Thunder selecting Kobe Bufkin from Michigan, and I do like this selection quite a bit for Oklahoma City, given the fact that he's almost a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander light. Now, I'm not comparing him to Shai. I'm not saying he's going to be the next Shai, but he's got a very similar physical archetype. Defensively, he impacts the game in similar ways. He gets block shots as a guard. I think he's very good at staying in the play even when he's beat off the dribble, very similar to Shai. And he's a unique driver. Now, I don't think he's as dynamic and dominant as a driver as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander has turned into, but he's got, again, similar physical profile. And I think really the big thing of how he fits Oklahoma City is he's got that connective DNA, very similar to what we've seen from a lot of different Michigan Wolverines. He's just a player who understands how to help his team generate open looks. If it's a ball reversal and it comes to him and there's one more pass to make, he'll make that extra pass. And that's been really a big part of Oklahoma City's new team post Russell Westbrook and post Paul George. They've done a really fantastic job fleshing out this roster and putting together pieces that are fits together. And with the positional size that they have, with Josh Giddey, with his size and length, with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and his size and length, Kobe Bufkin's not a bad fit onto this roster in terms of, oh, do you have too many guards? Because this team can guard up and down the lineup. I think Kobe Bufkin will be able to do that as well a bit, probably guarding 1 through 3 on occasion. And I think because of that, Oklahoma City can afford to take the player that they like over the player that they would supposedly need. I think Chet Holmgren coming back into the fold, hopefully having a healthy season this year, will really accelerate Oklahoma City's rebuild into a team that is now a playoff team and honestly a threat to come out of the first round and maybe even make some more noise in the Western Conference depending on how things actually shape out next year. But that's how talented this roster is currently. Pick 13, we move on to the Toronto Raptors, and we're back to what I've been mocking pretty much all year long. Cason Wallace out of Kentucky goes to the Toronto Raptors here with this selection. And for Toronto, Cason Wallace just feels like a Masai Ujiri pick. He's got long arms, he's a smart defender, puts his body in the way, and I think he's got really good defensive playmaking upside, averaged over 2 steals a game this past year in the SEC. And I think because of that, Toronto, kind of looking at what they have, they need that kind of guard back in there. Fred VanVleet is out in free agency this offseason. I think it is very likely he signs somewhere else. We'll see what happens with Gary Trent Jr., who is also a pending free agent. So it's possible the Raptors have not 1, but 2 backcourt spots to replace. And I think that going with a combo guard in Cason Wallace, some people have questions about, is he a point guard? Is he a 2? The one thing I'm going to say is he's a good basketball player. And if you're Toronto right now, a team that's on the outside looking in when it comes to making the postseason and kind of filling out your roster around Jakob Poeltl, Pascal Siakam, Scotty Barnes, and OG Anunoby. I think right now you just need good basketball players. Yes, you could argue you want this elite, smart pick-and-roll passer who is going to make the right read all the time. It's hard to get that at pick 13, especially early in their careers. Cason Wallace is going to be a guy who I think even if his ceiling isn't multi-time All-Star, I think he's going to be a long-term starter in the NBA. I think you could realistically look at him starting for Toronto as early as next season, kind of being that, rookie starting guard. Very rare to see. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was that for the Los Angeles Clippers back in his rookie season. And again, not saying Cason Wallace will be SGA, but I do think that, when you have a player who's NBA ready and can make an impact on day one of his career, it usually symbolizes that the guy's going to be a good player for his entire career. And I think the Raptors are getting that here, 13th overall. Moving on to pick 14, the final pick of the lottery, we have the New Orleans Pelicans here. And for trade discussions, the Pelicans, they've been all over the place. Brandon Ingram may or may not be available in a trade to pick number 2. Zion Williamson may or may not be available just in general, given some of his off-the-court stuff and the fact that he's barely been on the court in his NBA career up to this point. There's a lot of rumors circulating and swirling around the New Orleans Pelicans and how they're going to go about building this team. 14th overall, after failing to trade up, I have them selecting Jalen Hood-Schifino from Indiana, and I think this is an interesting selection given the fact that they took Dyson Daniels last year. You could maybe argue that they should have looked center here, and I think that there is a little bit of an argument to that. I strongly consider Derek Lively, but just I couldn't bring myself to doing that because I feel like Dyson Daniels plays more of a wing connective role rather than a true point guard role, and I think that's what Jalen Hood-Schifino, when he reaches his pinnacle as a basketball player, that's what he's going to be. You're going to put the ball in his hands, have him operate in the pick and roll. He's really adept as a screen utilizer. He does a great job not only using the screen the first time, but he understands how to kind of maneuver his defender in a way that he wants him to go, whether that's through the screen and then rescreen action. He just does a great job in general utilizing screens to get to spots on the floor where he's a capable scorer, which is specifically the mid-range. He's got a very good mid-range pull-up. I would argue one of the best in the class, if not the best in the class in that regard in terms of the frequency and the willingness to look for that shot. And I think overall, if you're the Pelicans, you have to feel pretty good about the end result here. Getting Hood-Schifino, he's got prototypical size to play the position, and I think he's going to be a nice contributor on day one of his career, which the Pelicans don't necessarily need that, but having a player who's ready and then can take some more steps forward. As a freshman, by the way, coming out, he's a really solid pick at this spot. Moving on to pick number 15, we have the Atlanta Hawks here. And I think the Atlanta Hawks are one of those very intriguing teams because they have a brand new coach, brand new GM who only has had one trade deadline and no draft, no free agency to make decisions yet. We'll see which way they go. But Landry Fields has a tough task ahead of him when it comes to building up this roster. Of course, Clint Capella, starting center. John Collins has been perpetually on the trade block. AJ Griffin was a really nice selection for this organization last year. And I think 15th overall for a team that doesn't get a ton of ball movement. In fact, they're kind of last in the NBA in ball movement. They just do not swing the ball very much, even though Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, both great passers. The ball is predominantly in their hands. So to make use of that, you need to find guys who I think can help you in other ways, and that's by being a movement shooter, which is why 15th overall, the Atlanta Hawks select Jordan Hawkins from UConn. I'm actually having a video come out today on movement shooting and what that looks like and how Jordan Hawkins, Gradey Dick, Seth Lundy can all help NBA teams by being really good gravity movement shooters who can open up spacing and just play off the ball very, very well. And I think if you're looking at fit, Jordan Hawkins might be one of the better fits in this year's draft to Atlanta just because of his ability to, again, function without the basketball in his hands. That's really where he's best. And if you're trying to find guys who can complement Trae Young and DeJounte Murray, two, again, ball-dominant players, which there's nothing wrong with that. I feel like you say that and people kind of have a negative connotation. They're ball-dominant because they're so darn good, right? They can play with the ball in their hands and make good decisions and really lead offenses, but you need guys who can complement that, play around it. I think that they already have a decent cast of players who do that. But Jordan Hawkins is a big level up for them. I think they really badly missed Kevin Huerter this past year. His off-the-ball movement was really important for them and something I had overlooked before he had gotten traded. And I think now they have a chance to re-add that type of shooting and player movement, around their two guards. And I think now they're in a spot where they're going to take a big step forward, making the selection of Jordan Hawkins. Moving on to pick number 16, we have the Utah Jazz here now at this spot. Remember, the Utah Jazz earlier on went with Anthony Black, a combo guard with a ton of size, defensive potential, and just overall great, I think, skill set that translates really well to the NBA. At 16, they're going to go with a high upside swing and a player who I think actually does complement Anthony Black because he's a little bit different, more of a perimeter shot maker, and he's a little bit smaller, and I would say not quite as good defensively, but the shot-making upside's there. And if Utah, with all of their selections that they have from Minnesota and Cleveland and their own, if they're going to take stabs, this might be one of those guys that you want to take a stab on. That's Keyonte George out of Baylor. He is a streaky shot maker. Now, when he's hot, he's really hot. In fact, he's had weeks and months this past year as a freshman for Baylor where it just felt like he could not miss anytime he put a shot up. But then there was also stretches where I felt like, oh my gosh, this guy continues to shoot us out of games or just kind of shoots and there must be a lid on the rim. And I think that's going to be something that consistency isn't a trait. Consistency, I think, is an indicator of skill. And what I mean by that is when a player is not like exponentially more skilled than others, there's going to be ups and downs because you're kind of compensating for defense and other things are impacting your success level. The most consistent players are just flat out the best players because they're better than the others around them and they consistently exert their force, their talent, their will on the game. I think that Keyonte George, there's ways to go for him in his actual skill set right now. I think he has to really lock down his reps on a lot of the shot attempts that he tries to take. But I think if he does that, he could be a massive home run. This is kind of giving me Donovan Mitchell vibes back when the Jazz traded for the pick that the Nuggets had to select Donovan Mitchell in the teens. This is another pick in the teens. Now, I'm not saying Keyonte George is going to be Donovan Mitchell. In fact, I really do not believe that. But it's giving me those kind of vibes as like a streaky shot maker who, if things hit, he could end up being a huge home run next to Anthony Black, who could be the starting backcourt of the long-term future for the Utah Jazz. And we have our first trade to announce. The Indiana Pacers are now on the clock after making a trade with the Los Angeles Lakers. The trade, the details are pick 26, pick 32, and pick 55 out the door to Los Angeles. And the Pacers in return receive pick number 17. So they move up 9 spots. It cost them 2 second-round picks to do that, one of them being a very high second-rounder, pick 32. I drew inspiration from a trade back a few draft years ago between the Oklahoma City Thunder and Minnesota Timberwolves, where the Thunder moved up for Aleksej Pokusevski. Very similar trade here. And the Pacers have one specific player in mind that they're moving up for, and it's a player that I do think that they're very interested in adding. Remember, they drafted Jarace Walker earlier, a versatile forward who can defend up and down the board. At 17, they're drafting Leonard Miller, G League Ignite, a player who, fantastic rebounder. That's really the first thing that you need to talk about when you talk about Leonard Miller is the work that he does on the glass. Averaged over 3 offensive rebounds per game in the G League this past season. Remember, that is against professional grown men. He was putting up over 3 offensive rebounds a game. It's not like he was playing a whole bunch of high schoolers and just exerting his size and strength. He was doing that against men. Okay, it's very impressive. And I think Indiana, a team that, if we're looking at them getting better and just kind of improving this roster, of course, forward play is really one of the key things. I think all Pacers fans know that. Defense is really important. We talked about that with Jarace Walker. And I think rebounding, adding some more strong, solid rebounding next to Miles Turner and now next to Jarace Walker, I think could go a really long way in kind of improving this Pacers team. In fact, this pick is somewhat reminiscent to pick number 17 last year, where the Houston Rockets selected Tari Eason at pick number 17. Now, I think another high-level rebounder, very productive player, just like Tari Eason was for LSU. We have a very productive player going 17th overall to the Indiana Pacers. And from the Lakers' perspective, it makes a lot of sense adding more draft assets. It gives you some flexibility this offseason. Maybe you can reroute some of those seconds into a trade, or you can just go ahead and take there, because I think Rob Pelinka has done a very good job drafting later in the draft. That's one of his biggest strengths as a decision maker. So we'll see who the Lakers come back and draft a little bit later on. Pick number 18, the Miami Heat on the board now at this spot. And for Miami, they're a little bit behind on the whole draft thing. Of course, having a deep postseason run, that ends up playing into things. Now, of course, their scouts have been watching guys, but they haven't had a ton of players in the building. But one notable player that they did have in the building, who I'm going to mock to them here, 18th overall, Nick Smith Jr. from Arkansas, a player who was perceived as a potential top 5, top 7 pick before this year's draft cycle really got underway, before playing a college game. And then he ended up dealing with a knee injury that sidelined him. He was inconsistently in and out of the lineup, and because of that, he never really found a rhythm. Now, when he was in the lineup for stretches of time, he would go on runs where he'd average 18 to 20 points a game, but when he was kind of in and out, he would come back and have real dud performances. And I don't want to hang that over his head. I think that there's a pathway with his ball handling and his touch. He could end up becoming a really unique scorer, and I think if you're going to Miami with their development track record of guards, I think that you'd have to take the over on Nick Smith Jr. being a great player, because he would probably develop massively for the Miami Heat. He's got really good size at 6'5". Now he's really thin. He's in fact paper thin, I would say, as a guard, but he's got some elements that you have to like in terms of the two-level shot making, both mid-range and from the three-point line. Now, one thing he doesn't do, which I do think Miami would like to address, providing rim presence. Nick Smith Jr. plays very, like I said, paper thin. And because of that, he doesn't get to the rim a ton. And when he does, usually it's in a straight line or in transition. It's not so much of, hey, in the half court, I'm going to go in and challenge a big at the rack. It's not that way, and that's okay. And remember, this is the 18th overall pick. You're not going to find guys who are surefire home run like selections at pick 18 very typically. I think Nick Smith Jr. can be a good player. I think he's going to need some development to get there. But if there's a team that's proven that they know how to develop guards and get them improved and find processes and development plans that work, I think it's the Miami Heat under Erik Spoelstra. Moving on now to pick number 19, we see the Golden State Warriors here, and I think there's a few different things to consider. There's been a lot of reports about the Golden State Warriors potentially wanting to move up, potentially wanting to move down, and potentially wanting to move out for a veteran. I'm not sure if any of those pathways are realistic options for them, though. Just looking at the money on their roster, maybe they could move Kuminga somewhere. I just don't know if Kuminga at 19 is fetching you something that's worthwhile. And I think with a brand new GM, it's really hard to project what they're actually going to do. With Bob Myers, maybe you could have taken a guess. But again, not new management, because he was the assistant GM before, but a new lead decision maker. And because of that, they're a little bit harder to project what they're going to do. For me, I'm taking a guy who I think they would potentially consider best player available. We've seen him go quite a few spots higher in some of my other mock drafts throughout the year, and that is Derek Lively II from Duke. And some Warriors fans probably just got chills down their spines, because they might be feeling, oh my gosh, this is Wiseman 2.0, because he's another freakishly big athletic center who can protect the rim and has all of the physical tools. The question is, what's his feel for the game, and how does he kind of stick out from Wiseman in a different way? How does he impact winning? How does he fit this core right now? Which is part of the reason why the Warriors would want to look to move this pick potentially if they could. I think Lively, though, if you're trying to sell yourself on him, in zone offense, he's done a decent job passing back out to the perimeter. Not super consistent, not something I would rely on. But if you want to kind of see, is there a little bit of offensive feel here? I think that's what you're selling yourself on. And also, as the Warriors kind of naturally gravitate toward a little bit more Steph Curry high pick and roll, I think getting a legitimate downhill presence like Derek Lively, a little bit different than Kevon Looney, of course, is an above the rim finisher. He's just a bit bigger, a little bit lengthier, more athletic than Kevon Looney. I think he gives them another unique pairing with Steph Curry. I think Lively, although not being super productive in his time at Duke statistically, he did average over 4 blocks per 40 minutes. And I think he's a player that if he stays out of foul trouble, or in this situation where he doesn't have to be in foul trouble too much because he's kind of coming off the bench behind Looney right away, he's in a spot where he's going to have some time to develop, but he's also going to be able to get meaningful reps early in his career in a setting that can be somewhat difficult to play, but hopefully they get it right this time around in his development. Moving on to pick number 20, we have the Houston Rockets, and there's a ton of reports about this team wanting to move the selection as well. You can understand as to why, because the Rockets are hungry to take steps forward and improve this roster. And honestly, I think that there's a hope inside the building to make the playoffs. Otherwise, Rafael Stone might have some concerns about what his job security looks like. 20th overall, though, I couldn't find a real trade that I love for the Houston Rockets. So instead, I have them selecting Jett Howard out of Michigan, a player that I think that they like internally. I think that his skill set would fit off the wing. Remember, they went with Brandon Miller, 4th overall. So the Rockets have added not one, but 2 dynamic wings who can do a few different things for you. Brandon Miller, of course, the higher potential player between the two. I think is proven more at the collegiate game than Jett Howard. But Jett Howard did shoot extremely well on catch and shoot opportunities this past year, over 40% on those scenarios. And then he also flashes a very tight handle. I think he can handle in the pick and roll for you. Honestly, if I had to give him a comparison to a player, I think he'd be like a slightly more athletic Joe Ingles, which maybe doesn't sound super alluring, but getting that at pick 20 is a huge home run. I think he's got an old man's game in a good way, and I think he's just going to be a reliable piece to add into your roster. He's not the most athletic guy, but I think he's going to fit in really good, and I think he's going to give Houston some of that stability that they've been lacking over the last couple of years off the wing specifically. He's a big upgrade over Jae'Sean Tate, and now the fact that you have him likely coming off the bench behind Miller and Jabari Smith, I think creates a really interesting young core for the Rockets to continue to build around while also adding in veteran talent through free agency. Moving on to pick 21, we have the Brooklyn Nets here now at this spot, and for Brooklyn, having back-to-back picks, I'm switching some things up in this final mock for them. The Nets have reported interest in finding a guard, someone who can handle the ball for them, create some offense, and I'm going with a player that I don't believe I've mocked as high as 21 yet, and that is Ben Sheppard out of Belmont. Ben Sheppard, I think, is an intriguing player, has a really good live handle, specifically his hesitation dribble, which he utilizes to his advantage to get downhill. Kind of has a little bit of Austin Reeves to him as a player. Now, I think that there's some ways to go for him to grow as kind of a decision maker and lead guard. I don't know if he has those qualities or those traits right now, but I think that for Brooklyn, a team that needs another ball handler, needs another creator off of, say, Spencer Dinwiddie, if he's still there in a couple days, we'll see. Spencer Dinwiddie might be one of those players that gets routed somewhere this offseason. The Nets just need young players who can create, and I think Ben Sheppard has the traits to do that, and I think it's about finding the consistency and just improving the skill set to the point where he's going to be able to reliably perform night in, night out. But I think the Nets, it's a very intriguing grab, 21st overall player who I think can step in, play quite a bit in day one of his career, but also has more room to grow going forward. Then pick 22, the Nets again on the clock, of course. And at this pick, it's about trying to find some size and perimeter shot making off of it to complement Nick Claxton. And this is probably going to be a bench piece for them. Probably won't start, but I think just a really solid, strong addition to their roster. And that is Chris Murray from Iowa, twin brother of Keegan Murray, who lit the league on fire last year from behind the three-point line. Chris Murray, another example here of consistency and how I don't believe it's a trait. I think it's a byproduct of skill. Chris Murray's less consistent three-point shooter than Keegan Murray. He's a little bit more up and down. Sophomore year, he was fantastic. Junior year kind of fell back down to about 33% from three. Now, there's understandable reasons as to why as well. He was tasked with doing a little bit more with the ball in his hands, naturally generating some tougher shots for him. So I'm not going to put all of my stock into that. I think that Chris Murray, with open looks, he's going to knock down a decent number of shots that you can keep him on the floor. He's got pretty good size. He's an instinctual cutter. And I think Chris Murray's kind of the perfect example of what this class is, of not only a lot of top-end talent, but there's so many good, like, rotational players of guys that I'm like, when I'm going through one of these first-round mocks, there's about 40 guys or so that I'm thinking, this guy probably deserves some love in the first round. How do I give it to him? And I just can't for all of these guys. There's only 30 first-round picks. So because of that, some guys get left off, and I think Chris Murray, a guy who's been a staple in my first round, just the size and the perimeter shooting that he flashed at his pro day and some of the games throughout the season where he just seemingly couldn't miss, I think is enough to keep him in the top 22 picks in this year's draft. Pick 23, we're on to the Portland Trailblazers now. Remember, we went with Amen Thompson on a huge upside swing to begin the draft, and now at 23, I think this is the pick that's even more available than pick number 3, because I think 23 realistically could go out and get them a player that makes Damian Lillard feel comfortable with the direction that the organization is heading in when it comes to attempting to win and attempting to continue to build out the team. 23rd, though, if I couldn't find a trade partner for them, which I couldn't, one that I loved, I have them here at this spot selecting a player who I think is extremely NBA ready and at a position of need for the organization and providing a lot of different traits that they don't have currently, and that's Trayce Jackson-Davis from Indiana, a player who I have a firm first-round grade on. I think he's a really good player. I think a really sneakily underrated player who is one of the best post passers in this draft, arguably the best post passer in this draft. He's also got the traits to be a really good screen and roll guy because he's got good vertical athleticism. He rolls downhill hard. He's got good just overall athleticism when it comes to speed and quickness down the court. He can pass out of a short roll. He hasn't had to do that a ton for Indiana, but I think he's got the strengths and the skill set to grow into that. And by the way, I think he's day one ready. I think he could honestly start for Portland if they decide to move off of Jusuf Nurkic, which I wouldn't hate for them because I think Jackson Davis, a little bit more mobile and a lot more athletic defensively, giving you just overall more shot blocking, more rim presence defensively. I think he would be a big upgrade for them. Now, adjusting to the NBA game, the speed of the game, kind of the sets and how the league itself actually works, might limit his year one production a little bit compared to how ready he actually is from a skill set perspective, because it's just a whole new kind of learning curve going into the NBA. But I think 23rd overall, the Blazers get a player who, if he's starting games by November, December, I wouldn't be completely shocked by that at all. Moving on to pick number 24 now, we have the Sacramento Kings. And I'm sure Kings fans are a little bummed that Chris Murray's not on the board for them anymore, but they're not going to be bummed when they hear who I have them selecting. 24th overall, Dariq Whitehead, forward out of Duke, who, like Nick Smith Jr., was a projected top 5, top 7-ish selection in the 2023 NBA draft well before the process really was underway. And the Kings get him here at 24, so clearly incredible value based on what the early projections were for him. He was the National Player of the Year at the high school ranks. Ended up not having a very productive overall season, averaged less than 10 points a game for Duke, but he was still extremely efficient as a three-point shooter, shot 42% from three, shot really great percentages both on guarded and non-guarded catch-and-shoot situations, according to Synergy. And off of that as well, I think he's a player that, after playing through an injury the entire year, you could almost bank on better production and better consistency from him, because he was kind of injury plagued throughout his freshman season due to a foot injury. He had a foot fracture, surgery on it before the year, didn't heal right, kind of wore on him all year long, and then actually ended up having surgery after the season. And he's going to be clear by training camp, according to his doctors and his staff, and some of the reports that I've heard up to this point. So Sacramento's getting a guy who could be a huge upside swing, really good offensive addition next to Sabonis and Fox. Again, it's about kind of spacing the court for those two, opening up their offense even more than already it was as the number one offense in the league. And I think just giving them another dynamic shot maker who can curl off screens and do a lot of different stuff for you in positive manners. Pick 25, we have the Memphis Grizzlies here now. And with this selection, I have the Memphis Grizzlies selecting Brandon Podziemski from Santa Clara. For the Grizzlies, I think the most important thing for them is going to be continuing to add more perimeter shot making, more perimeter skill set that fits their roster. I think right now the Grizzlies, they're going to be eyeing some big trades. I think OG Anunoby is going to be one of those targets that they would love to add if they found a pathway to get there. But nonetheless, it's about trying to find good complementary fits around Jaren Jackson Jr. and John Morant. And I think Desmond Bane obviously was a home run selection when they took him. And a big reason why they took him was his perimeter shot making and his perimeter shooting skill set. Brandon Podziemski is similar as a 40+% three-point shooter in college, shot on high volume, also handled the ball really good in the pick and roll, does a lot of different stuff for you, and he's very active defensively. I think he's a better Luke Kennard. I think that's the way he's going to end up playing out his career. Clearly the front office there valued shooting when they traded for Kennard, and now they have the chance to add a young, controllable contract who can really help space out the floor and impact this team in a positive manner going forward. Pick 26, now we have the Los Angeles Lakers. Remember, they have this selection after trading back with the Indiana Pacers. And 26th overall, I have the Los Angeles Lakers here selecting James Nagy, one of the more polarizing and intriguing prospects at this point of the process. After doing his measurements, combine level measurements, later in the process, he measured very, very well. 7 foot with shoes on, so pretty impressive size. A 7'7" wingspan, very massive wingspan, one of the better wingspans in this entire draft. And those athletic and physical traits that he possesses are going to be what ties him into a potential first-round selection. The Lakers, I had them potentially targeting him 17th overall before trading back, which is part of the reason why I thought trading down made some sense. I felt pretty confident with the teams ahead of them that they could maybe still get James Nagy a few picks later at 26 and add other assets as well in this year's draft to kind of balance out their depth, add some other pieces that could fit around their current roster. And I think realistically, Nagy, he has the traits to be a really good big. Now, is he NBA ready day one? No, I think he's a little bit raw. But the Lakers, for them, I know everyone's going to say, oh, take NBA ready, take NBA ready, take NBA ready. I think if it's the right prospect, you do that. But if there's a prospect that you do believe on that addresses a long-term need that this team is going to have, which is rim protection, interior size when Anthony Davis isn't on the court, it's James Nagy addresses those things. So I think that ultimately the Lakers are in a better spot now after trading down, getting more assets. They're going to be able to flesh out their roster. Don't worry. We're going to add some NBA-ready guys later in this mock as well for them. But I think 26 is a great starting spot for them with James Nagy. Pick number 27, we have the Charlotte Hornets here now. And the Hornets, a very difficult team to mock for because they have multiple second-round picks as well as this selection at 27. So watch out for a trade. We're going to talk about a trade here in the future for them. But at 27, I have the Charlotte Hornets going with Ryan Rupert from the New Zealand Breakers of the NBL, a player who relatively raw offensively right now, but we've seen the Hornets go to the NBL before the draft. They took LaMelo Ball there, felt very comfortable selecting him 3rd overall in his class. And I think if they're looking at kind of the physical tools that Ryan Rupert possesses at 6'7" with a significantly plus wingspan at about 7'2", he's an impactful defender who's got very active hands. He can pick up 94 feet, and I think that's some of the selling points you need to put for Charlotte after drafting Scoot Henderson 2nd overall. With the 6'9" wingspan, you can come back and get a player with a 7'2" wingspan and kind of flesh out this really intriguing defensive team that even if they're not the biggest and strongest team, they're going to have a lot of length and they've got the wingspan to boot with it. LaMelo Ball, of course, at about 6'7" as a guard. You've got some good size and length. Now it's about trying to complement those with actual tangible skills, and Ryan Rupert defensively on the ball. Again, the active hands are really the main selling point for him. He's able to poke the ball loose. He's, I think, an aggressive defender, which I think is good for Charlotte. I think they need something like that just because I don't really trust the whole team as of right now to be sit down in a stance and guard for 24 seconds type of team. So the more steals, the more early transition opportunities you can get, the better. And I think Charlotte here is getting a guy who's going to generate a good amount of those going forward. Pick 28 now, we have the Utah Jazz back on the clock. Remember earlier on they went with Anthony Black at pick 9, Keyonte George at pick 16, and at 28 I feel really good about this mock selection for them as well. Gigi Jackson from South Carolina, 28th overall. He is the youngest player in the 2023 NBA draft, and if you look at Danny Ainge's draft history, he loves to take some of these tantalizing high upside forwards toward the back end or the middle half of the first round. And at 28, he can definitely justify selecting a player like Gigi Jackson, who had, in my opinion, a very bad freshman season. Their team was terrible. His individual production and efficiency was bad. The team just wasn't good. And I think Gigi Jackson was kind of at the center of that, but he flashed a ton of skills that I think are portable to the NBA. He can handle the ball for his size. He can knock down open jump shots. He can drive and finish at the rim, throws down East Bay dunks in practice. Those are some tangible things that you can point to and say, with the right development, and I think that they should feel really good about Will Hardy. He was a fantastic hire. With the right development, this guy could be a massive steal at this spot. And I think that's something you could realistically talk yourself into, and I feel like I wouldn't hate that for them. I think, in fact, Utah would be very firmly positioned going forward. After drafting Gigi Jackson, they have enough upside swings, but they also got a sure thing in Anthony Black, a player who I think is going to be helpful for them. They don't have to rush them into minutes because they have Walker Kessler, Lauri Markkanen, and some other contributors. They can take this thing slow, develop these guys while also putting somewhat of a competitive team on the floor. I think it's the best of both worlds for Utah, whose their long-term ultimatum and goal is to develop while trying to be competitive, and I think they're going to be able to do it. Pick 29, we're back to the Indiana Pacers now with their final pick in this year's draft now, of course, after trading 32 and 55. Both of their second rounders are out the door, but remember, up to this point, they brought in Jarace Walker, Leonard Miller, and now they have a chance at a third first-round pick here, and one that I think is going to make a lot of Pacers fans really happy, because I think this is a guy that a lot of Pacers fans have circled on their board. Oliver Maxence-Prosper from Marquette is the selection, a fantastic transition player. I already talked about how this team with Buddy Hield, they get a lot of good early transition looks. Now give them one of the most dynamic downhill floor runners in the draft, a guy who I think puts a lot of pressure on the rim in transition. He's just an extremely hard worker. He's like the Energizer Bunny with his ability and willingness to work extremely hard. And I think for an Indiana Pacers team that right now they have some really good finesse players like Hield. I think Halliburton, I'm not knocking him here, but he's a little bit more finesse than he is physical. That's perfectly fine because he's a heck of a finesse player as kind of his passing and his ability to knock down perimeter shots. He's really good. I'm fully on the Tyrese Halliburton bandwagon. I have been since he was at Iowa State. I couldn't believe that he fell outside the top 10 in his own draft. I couldn't believe it when that happened. Indiana's in a great spot. And I think with what they've been able to add in this draft, Jarace Walker, big and strong. Leonard Miller, big and impactful and productive and strong. Now at 29, you're coming back and getting another big, strong forward who I think is going to be able to guard across multiple positions. He's going to hit the glass on both ends of the floor. He's going to run in transition, and he's going to put a body on guys. And I think that's going to complement this team massively. And I think the one thing the Pacers were really missing after trading Domantas Sabonis was kind of that physicality. They're addressing it threefold in this year's draft, and I feel really good about the results here for Indiana from the first round. Now the final pick of the first round, we have the Los Angeles Clippers here at this spot, and for the Clippers, I think that this is an interesting situation for them. They could go and take best available, and maybe they address a guard. I think that there's a lot of guards out here that could help them long term, especially given the fact that Russell Westbrook is headed toward free agency. It's going to be difficult for them to fully retain him. I think that Russ will have suitors in a couple of places. I think the Chicago Bulls are for sure one destination that will have interest in signing Russell Westbrook. But I'm choosing to go with a non-guard because my expectation is currently that Chris Paul ends up with the Los Angeles Clippers in a reunion. So 30th overall, I have the Clippers selecting Noah Clowney out of Alabama, a modern big, and this is not the first time the Clippers have tried to find a modern big at the back end of the first round or kind of in that 25 to 35 range. Think back to Fiondu Kabengele, Daniel Oturu. This team has been trying to find a big who can space the floor for them, open up the court, let them play that 5-out style that they like to play without sacrificing some of that interior defensive presence. They've tried. They finally maybe get it here with Noah Clowney, who I think isn't a true anchor defensively, but at least he's big, strong, and has kind of the frame for it a little bit to at least body down low. And he's just bigger than other forwards. That's what I would say. So I think the Clippers here, it's something that at least makes some sense. You can strongly consider that as a beneficial option and look at it and say, look, maybe Noah Clowney is finally the big man that works out for them in this role. Like I've said, they've tried time and time again. It hasn't worked. Let's see if the third time's the charm here for the Los Angeles Clippers. The second round of my final 2023 NBA mock draft is brought to you by Aura. Aura is the new standard in digital security and offers comprehensive all-in-one protection for your finances, identity, and tech. In addition to identity theft and financial fraud protection, Aura offers antivirus malware software, white glove fraud resolution 24/7, 365 days a year, dedicated US-based case managers, and all plans include a $1 million insurance policy to cover losses and fees. I really recommend checking out Aura. Link will be in the description to that. You are entitled to a 14-day free trial through Utility Sports using the link in our description. Again, go check that out. Would really hate for you guys to miss out on that opportunity. Now with the 31st pick in the 2023 NBA draft, the Charlotte Hornets are on the clock here. Remember at 27, we had them go with Ryan Rupert after taking Scoot Henderson, 2nd overall. And now with the 31st pick, you might be wondering how they're on the clock. They made a trade here with the Detroit Pistons. They ended up sending out pick 34 and pick 41 for 31, which sounds like a decent amount of value to give up to only move up 3 spots. Why would they give up so much? And it's because there's a first-round player on the board yet for them, someone that they had internally graded fairly highly in Bryce Sensabaugh out of Ohio State. Fell through the cracks in the first round, lands at pick 31, and the Hornets decided to move up and get him to add a little bit more of that half-court offensive creation, specifically off the bench. And now they have an intriguing collection of young players who can score the basketball. Of course, LaMelo Ball, kind of more of that perimeter scoring skill set. Scoot Henderson can get to the rim, but also has a nice mid-range dribble pull-up. Bryce Sensabaugh is a very talented half-court scorer of the basketball, really good triple threat utilization. He can get to spots and score, plays through bumps. He's really strong. I think that's one thing that this new backcourt, this new combination of young backcourt players that Charlotte would have, they'd find themselves in a spot where they've got 2 players who are physically really gifted in terms of strength and just overall profiling. Scoot Henderson's got massive arms. The guy's absolutely jacked. And so is Bryce Sensabaugh, maybe a little bit less so, but he's also very, very strong. And I think the Hornets here at 31, they could realistically look at themselves as a worthwhile opportunity to move up in the draft a few spots to make sure that they get the guy that they like, especially since they have multiple second-round picks and they had multiple first-round picks in this mock draft. Pick 32, we're on to the Los Angeles Lakers again, who, remember, have this pick from the Indiana Pacers in their trade that they worked out earlier. And 32nd overall, the Los Angeles Lakers select Amari Bailey from UCLA, so he stays right there in Los Angeles, and I think it's a really great fit for him going to the Los Angeles Lakers because of his skill set, the things he can provide to this team. The Lakers are a team that I think the more youth and more depth that they can add through the draft, the better. And so far, they've done a great job. They get James Najee, who's maybe a little bit of a project, but he has all the physical tools. And Amari Bailey's got pretty good size as well. Underrated athlete. He's left-handed, very reliant on his left hand, by the way. I think that's going to be a key area of development for him, is opening up to his right hand a little bit more, both as a facilitator and a finisher. But all in all, the Lakers here get a talented backcourt player. Dennis Schroeder's a free agent. We'll see what his market ends up looking like. My expectation right now is he's back with the Lakers. But then really the big questions around D'Angelo Russell. Will the Lakers bring him back? Will they not? Do they make some type of big move for a star? What's really the end goal right now for the Lakers? And through this draft, the big thing I wanted to prioritize was flexibility. If they keep their role players, then they should take off of upside, which is what they've done, James Najee and Amari Bailey. But I think Bailey's one of those rare combinations of some second round upside, but also being a player who, if you need him to play, he can play for you right now. I think he could give you some quality minutes. I think he's an aggressive defender. I think that's something that would help the Lakers as well at the point of attack defensively. And I think all in all, the Lakers get significantly better through this draft. Pick 33, the San Antonio Spurs back on the clock again. Of course, first overall, they made the no-brainer selection of Victor Wembanyama. So for our Spurs fans who've been patiently waiting, with the 33rd pick in the 2023 NBA draft, the San Antonio Spurs select Colby Jones out of Xavier. And this is just flat out a good basketball player, and this feels like a Spurs-type pick because this guy just knows how to get his hands on the basketball. He makes winning plays. He knocks down open jump shots. He drives the ball pretty well. He can pass on the move with a live dribble. He just does a lot of things well. And you might be wondering, well, how did this guy not go earlier then? There was a lot of teams that I strongly considered Colby Jones for from about 24 to 33 here. So I finally landed on him as the answer, the selection here for the San Antonio Spurs. I feel like this is roughly the right range. I think teams in the back end of the first round will strongly consider him. He's got really solid skill set that's going to work out quite well for a lot of teams. And I think that ultimately San Antonio, with already having a good collection of wing players, they get a little bit deeper, a little bit better, specifically kind of that hybrid 2-3 position. And the Spurs, they add to their currently existing young talent with a player who's going to fit right into that Spurs culture. Pick 34, we move on to the Detroit Pistons, who now have this pick after moving out of 31 in that trade with the Charlotte Hornets. And at 34, they take a player who I think is going to be actually a quite good fit with them in Maxwell Lewis from Pepperdine. Not very often do we see a player from Pepperdine drafted. I think the most recent one was Kessler Edwards a few years ago, and then before that I couldn't even tell you. But Maxwell Lewis, I think, just overall a pretty intriguing shot maker. I think he's really reliant on finishing below the rim despite having some decent positional size. He's kind of more of a finesse player, which is okay because remember, the Pistons earlier on, we had them go with Cam Whitmore, who he's like a bull in a china shop with how strong and physical he is. So I don't think that you have to worry about not being a physical team, especially when you have Isaiah Stewart on your roster. I mean, the Pistons have some maulers already. They don't have to worry about that as much. I think the big thing for them is worrying about kind of perimeter shot making, who's going to shoot the basketball when Cade and Jaden Ivey generate some open looks. And just stretching out the floor a little bit more, Maxwell Lewis does that. I think it's a really nice selection for them, 34th overall. Moving on to pick 35, we have the Boston Celtics here now at this spot. And based on what the Boston Celtics did last year, where they took a big upside swing on J.D. Davison in the second round, a guy who, when they drafted him, I knew, hey, this is not going to be a year one or probably year two contributor. They're going to have some patience here with some of these players that they select. And 35th overall, I think that they're going to do something similar here. The Boston Celtics select Sidy Cissoko from G League Ignite, a player who is still very young, I think quite raw, but he's flashed a lot of those tools. Again, J.D. Davison, one of the most athletic players in last year's draft, he had some tools. Sidy Cissoko, I think, has more tools than J.D. Davison. I think there's a better pathway to him maybe growing into and becoming a good player. And Sidy Cissoko, like one of those tools is a fantastic spin move. He has a really good understanding of when to spin, how to utilize his kind of downhill like slashing capability and leverage that into, oh, the guy's trying to cut me off here, let me spin back off of his hip and get to where I want to go. And then he also passes off of a live dribble fairly well. Now, I think it's a little sporadic and wild currently. It's going to be a development process for him. But the Celtics, they're not in a need right now to add serious contribution at pick 35. In fact, it's going to be hard for them to find somebody who cracks their 8-man rotation realistically. So instead, take off of the upside, see if a guy can pop off for you here. And maybe you have an intriguing piece who a few years down the road becomes either a really good trade chip or a player who fits into your existing core. And I think Sidy Cissoko could be one of those two options. Pick 36, we move on to the Orlando Magic now at this spot. And earlier on, Magic fans might be a little pressed at me. Went with Taylor Hendricks and Bilal Coulibaly. We did not end up taking what we would consider a pure shooter, a movement shooter. But this is part of my reasoning as to why. I feel like at 36, this player is going to be available for them. Seth Lundy out of Penn State, and this guy can really shoot it. He's shot a very good efficiency from three over the past few years, and he does it on pretty difficult attempts, just given the fact that he's a pure movement shooter, also shoots off the move, off the dribble. I just think all in all, he's a guy who's proven that he's a dangerous and tough shot maker. And if you're looking for a little bit of spacing here for Orlando, you could say, well, at pick 6 we could take one, or at pick 11 we could take one. Yes, maybe it's a little early and it's a really expensive asset to spend on a shooter, or we could just hope that one of them's there at 36 for us. And that's exactly what they did here, and it panned out for them. Seth Lundy, again, he's not Jordan Hawkins, he's not Gradey Dick. There's a reason he's going 20-ish spots lower in my mock here. But I think that some of his skills and some of the skills that Orlando would specifically want him for, they're good enough to put him on the court. And because of that, you don't have to necessarily spend a top 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11 pick in the draft to address those things. You're grabbing one at 36 that fits. And by the way, Taylor Hendricks shoots just fine. Bilal Coulibaly's proven to be a pretty nice spot-up shooter. So I think Orlando's gotten significantly better through this draft so far, with a lot of upside to boot. Moving on to pick 37, the Denver Nuggets now. This pick, remember, they just traded for it from the Oklahoma City Thunder, so they now have picks 37 and 40 in this year's draft. After winning the title, they're going to have 2 shots to add to their rotation, and this first one feels like a no-brainer for them if he's available. Given the fact that Bruce Brown's headed toward free agency likely, it makes perfect sense in the world to take an impactful player who's maybe a non-shooter. The Denver Nuggets, pick 37, select Andre Jackson Jr., UConn, and for UConn, he did a lot of the dirty work. Jordan Hawkins was that skilled movement shooter, finesse player. Andre Jackson Jr. just did a lot of the dirty work, made winning plays, was extremely aggressive when he needed to be. And although he's never going to be a 20-point per game scorer, 15-point per game scorer even, I think off of Nikola Jokic, he's one of those players you could argue would be a really great fit into Denver. It's hard to see anyone being a bad fit onto the Denver Nuggets, honestly, with how that team's kind of constituted and constructed. But ultimately, the Nuggets at 37, they find themselves a winner, a guy who's going to fit into that locker room and the culture. Remember last year they drafted a guy in Christian Brown who had just won the national title. They still have Peyton Watson, who I think is an intriguing long-term upside projection. We'll have to wait and see what we really get from him. But Andre Jackson Jr., 37th overall, makes a ton of sense for this team. Then moving on to pick number 38, we have the Sacramento Kings here at this spot. And for the Kings, there was one player I really liked for them. Remember, we went with Dariq Whitehead, 24th overall. In a lot of my mocks, I've been kind of looking at Ryan Rupert as a realistic option. But I think, why take Rupert in round 1 if you're Sacramento? If you're pretty comfortable that in round 2, you could come back and take Jordan Walsh out of Arkansas. And Jordan Walsh, to me, is basically a clone of Ryan Rupert, to the point where I wouldn't take Ryan Rupert in round 1 if I'm pretty confident I would get Jordan Walsh in round 2, because they are essentially the same height, essentially the same wingspan. Walsh, I think, less playmaky, like less of a playmaker defensively. He doesn't poke the ball loose the same way that Ryan Rupert does. He doesn't have that activity hands level, but he's a little bit more disciplined even. So there's some pros and positives to that. I think Sacramento, like, yes, getting out and running and getting some steals would be great for them. They already do a great job of getting out and running as it is. But I think all in all, if you were able to find a way to sit down and get some more stops defensively on a regular basis, the Kings would be a really, really dangerous team. They almost beat the Warriors in round 1 this past year, and I think with the Jordan Walsh selection and Dariq Whitehead, they've addressed their forward spots pretty well. Needed more lengthy wings. They've gotten them in this mock, and I feel pretty good about the direction of this franchise with, I believe, one more pick yet to come in this draft for them as well. Pick 39, the Charlotte Hornets now on the clock again. You see why I was willing to part with 34 and 41 for them in a trade for 31, because they still have another top 40 pick here. At 39, the Charlotte Hornets select Chris Livingston from Kentucky. Chris Livingston, I don't think he's gotten a lot of love around the draft community this year, but I think he deserves it. He's a fantastic rebounding wing. Talked about Leonard Miller and his productivity on the as a rebounder. Chris Livingston was notably less dominant. He was not nearly as productive, but this guy can rebound. And again, we're looking to add some toughness and physicality and some of the things that Charlotte's been lacking. At 27, we went with that with Ryan Rupert. 31, we got a really strong player, someone who's physical and Bryce Sensabaugh. 39, we go get Chris Livingston, who's impactful on the offensive glass. And I think we're targeting tangible skill set areas that the Hornets need to add to their roster. And I think it's a really nice selection for them. I like Livingston quite a bit. I think he's an underrated player and somebody who can kind of probably carve out a good role for himself. I wouldn't say he's Josh Hart, but he's got some of those similar characteristics as to what has made Josh Hart a really good wing in this league, despite some shooting concerns and those kinds of things. I think Livingston has a pretty good base work of fundamentals to play with, and I think out of that, if the right development occurs, he could end up being a really nice selection, 39th overall. Pick number 40, the Denver Nuggets, back on the clock again. And if we're going to go with winners, we might as well take a guy who won a ton of games in the WCC playing for the Zags, and that is Julian Strawther from Gonzaga. Now, Nuggets fans might say, whoa, you didn't draft us a center. There wasn't one out here that I thought, yeah, this is 100% the pick that they should make. I thought about Adama Sanogo. I thought about a couple of guys. You could maybe argue that there's a player out there that maybe they'd want to take. But realistically, I thought, okay, when the team's at its best, Nikola Jokic is on the floor. So let's get a variety of players who can work around Nikola Jokic. Again, pretty much everyone in the league can. But let's get more and more talent, more and more good contributing players around that. And Julian Strawther, a good shot maker, a competitive defender, had a 40-point game this past year for Gonzaga, which was not on my bingo card. I was not expecting that to be something that happened this past year in college basketball, but it did. And I think that he has progressed each and every year in his time in college, which I think is just a good sign that his development is progressing along. Now, I don't think he's going to be a player that ever becomes like a consistent starter or somebody who you're going to give high minutes to, 30-minute-a-game guy. But I think he's going to be one of those, hey, he is a nice depth piece, fits around your roster, doesn't screw things up when he's on the court. And, you know, that sounds like it's a little sarcastic. It's not. That's a really important thing that if you can find a wing at pick 40 that does what you're asking him to do and fits in a role and plays off of your best player, it's a really good selection. I think the Nuggets got a lot better already through this mock draft as well, grabbing not one but two, I think, impactful wings who have different skill sets completely. Pick 41, the Detroit Pistons now again on the clock after that trade with the Charlotte Hornets. This is the second selection that they got, and earlier on for the Pistons we targeted Maxwell Lewis, talking about shooting. We're getting even more shooting here with this selection. We're selecting Hunter Tyson from Clemson, a player who I'm not even sure if a lot of the viewers know who he is. Hunter Tyson, a unique, dynamic shot maker, moves without the basketball fairly well, and I also think just with really good raw size. The most comparable player to him in the draft is probably Gradey Dick. Now, Gradey Dick's just significantly better than him, but from like a physicals standpoint in terms of how tall and big this guy is, as well as the shot making from the perimeter, that's really the player that you'd have to kind of link him to a little bit. Now, he's not nearly the same player, actually. I don't think he's as good as Gradey Dick, but I think he would be a no-brainer fit here in Detroit as a lethal shot maker from the outside. And with the second round exception, having more second round picks, the better. You can realistically find ways to bring these guys into your roster without eating up some of your cap flexibility and some of your exception flexibility. And I think the Pistons here at 41 feel really good about grabbing both Maxwell Lewis in the second round and Hunter Tyson in the second round. Moving on to pick 42, we have the Washington Wizards here now at this spot. And for Washington, I think this is a really interesting pick. And the reason I'm going to go with this selection, Michael Winger, in his time with the Clippers, they took a lot of big swings on players who used to be highly touted high school prospects and recruits who maybe didn't have the college careers or college seasons that they were hoping to have. With the 42nd overall pick, the Washington Wizards select Emoni Bates from Eastern Michigan, one selection after the Detroit Pistons. Maybe that's a mistake on my end. Maybe I should have mocked Emoni to the Detroit Pistons. But 42nd overall, Washington, after grabbing Ausar Thompson, kind of this intriguing athlete who maybe, if everything goes right, he can be a dynamic downhill slasher, has a pretty decent playmaking feel to him. Let's get him a deep range shot maker. Emoni Bates, one of the better deep range shooters in this draft. I know that sounds like hyperbole. It's not. The guy actually shoots really, really well from behind the three-point line, given the kind of degree of difficulty of his shots. A ton of his shots were self-created, self-made opportunities, and a lot of them came from well beyond the NBA three-point line. Now you might say, well, that's pretty bad shot selection. Yes, that's a good argument, but out of pretty bad shot selection, he made a decent amount of them. And that's really the argument to be had here about Emoni Bates and what his potential role could be in the NBA as an off-ball movement shooter. I think the Wizards here, a team that could probably give him a role early in his career and see if maybe you strike lightning in a bottle here at pick 42. Moving on to pick 43, we have the Portland Trailblazers on the clock again. And earlier on we went with Trayce Jackson-Davis. And I want to come back and draft another big because I'm trying to find different style bigs next to Damian Lillard, different than what he's predominantly had throughout his career of kind of a post scoring back to the basket, facilitating big man. Yes, Trayce Jackson-Davis does those things, but I also think he's just so much more athletic than Jusuf Nurkic. And then at 43, we're going to come and get an offensive skilled big man who is kind of an outside-in center in Tristan Vucevic from Partizan. I think he's an intriguing selection here. He had a pretty good combine for himself. I think a lot of people expect him to be a top 45 pick in this year's draft. Went 43rd overall in this mock, and I think the Blazers, you're again taking another stab on I think a positional need and just an overall skill set need of a little bit more floor spacing. I would be kind of surprised if Vucevic played significant minutes in year one of his career, but I think it's a decent long-term play, kind of thinking about the timeline of maybe Shaedon Sharpe. How do you put a player around him? Tristan Vucevic is a guy that could maybe grow into something for the Blazers down the road. Pick 44, the San Antonio Spurs here now. And for the Spurs, remember earlier on at 33, went with Colby Jones, I think an impactful player. Now I want to go with a player who fits a really defined and clear role in the NBA, and a guy who I think would be a nice spacer for them in Demoy Hodge from Missouri. Demoy Hodge hasn't gotten a lot of love either in the draft community. He's a predominantly modern player. At 6'4" with three-point shooting capabilities and only finishing at the rim, he really does not shoot any mid-range jump shots. He's like the perfect analytics boy, dream player for the NBA currently, where he only shoots threes, and he shoots them very well, by the way, as well as shooting at the rim, which, again, he shoots very well, by the way. He's got the skill set that fits as a role player. He's not going to take a bunch of tough shots. He's not going to have the whole, like, Isaiah Todd thing where, oh, another 18-foot jump shot? Okay, thanks, I guess. Like, some of those players just don't end up, functioning, and they don't end up contributing to good offense. I think Demoy Hodge is like an off-ball player and like a spot minute role guy actually does make quite a bit of sense, and I think the Spurs here did pretty well in the second round with Colby Jones and Demoy Hodge, 44th overall now. Moving on to pick 45, we have the Memphis Grizzlies, who I have going with Nikola Jarace from KK Mega from Mega Basket. And Nikola Jarace, I think at 6'7", has a really dynamic skill set. Can handle the ball a bit, can push in transition, has flashed some of his shooting as well. I think overall, Jarace, I think, is a pretty solid and strong prospect. And getting him 45th overall feels like a steal. In fact, if there's one player in the second round so far that I feel like maybe I should have had him go quite a bit higher, it's Nikola Jarace, because I could see a team falling in love with him in terms of like the handle at his size and maybe some of the perceived upside there. But the Grizzlies are a team that does make some sense as well. Looking at their draft history, they like guys who kind of fit the mold here of like a lengthy wing with some intriguing ball skills. Think back to when they took Santi Aldama, for example. I think Nikola Jarace could be a guy that makes a lot of sense, especially if, again, the Grizzlies, they might be lining up for a trade. If they send out a bunch of their current existing young pieces, they're going to want to take an upside swing at 45, and I think Jarace is one that you could sell yourself on realistically. Pick 46, the Atlanta Hawks here now, of course, went with Jordan Hawkins, 15th overall in the first round. And at 46, we're looking for another wing, but quite a bit different wing in Julian Phillips. A little bit smaller. He's not the biggest wing out there, but he's a player at 46 who I think you can sell yourself on because he's got an outstanding vertical. I believe he tested number 1 in the combine for vertical jump, which is very impressive. He's extremely young. He's able to move his feet well. And I think really the one thing you're counting on Julian Phillips growing into is a really kind of hounding point of attack defender. That's really what the hope is for him. And I think for Atlanta, you're taking off of upside here at 46 because right now, just with how deep this team is as currently constructed, I don't see them being able to find a guy at 46 that's like a real minutes contributor. So take a young player, give him a couple of years to develop. You're probably going to have to wait for him, put him down in the G League for a couple of years. But I think Julian Phillips has the physicals. He has some of the traits that you're looking for as an upside grab in round 2, and I think that's a really intriguing pick for them. 47, we have the Lakers on the clock again, and this is another player who I think could be a really nice fit for them long-term in Mojave King, another player who tested very well at the Combine. I think had a surprising vertical that not a lot of people were expecting, but this guy can also just knock down perimeter jump shots, and I think for people looking at the Lakers from a mock draft perspective, they're probably all expecting, oh, shooter, 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 shooter. The reality is Rob Pelinka won't draft that way. So for me, in my mock draft, regardless of what I believe a team should do, I try and get into the kind of realm of, hey, this is what I expect their actual GM to really be looking at, but also kind of that realm of, hey, does this actually make sense? Would this be something I strongly actually consider if I was in their shoes? And then you have to kind of find that blend of that. For me, I feel like I've done that so far with some of their selections. I feel like, drafting some of the players that we've taken, like Amari Bailey at 32 makes a lot of sense, I think. James Najee, I think you could sell yourself on at 26. I think that this has been a pretty good mock draft for them so far. They're ending up walking out of this draft with 4 selections instead of just 2. So overall, they've done a good job for themselves, adding in extra assets and finding themselves in a spot to take swings on Mojave King type players who have that perimeter shot making. I think everyone would love to add that for the Lakers, but then also some athleticism and some other stuff to kind of bank on as well as a prospect. Pick 48 now, we have the Los Angeles Clippers on the clock again. And for the Clippers, I have them going with Jalen Slauson out of Furman, player who, I'm going to tell you right now, 4 or 5 months ago, I didn't really have on my draft radar as a likely second round pick. I thought, probably an undrafted guy, if he even were to get like a two-way or anything like that type of deal, but then really gained a lot of notoriety for himself. He's a good physical frame, pretty athletic for his position, and I think as a guy who, he's not going to be a big minutes contributor. In fact, Slauson to me, I'm not sure if he's a player that we're ever going to see a ton in the NBA. But I think all in all at 48, if you're taking kind of a swing on a player, you're looking for wings with kind of the physicals to at least find a role potentially in the NBA. And I think Slauson fits at least that criteria, which is why the Clippers consider him at 48. Moving on to pick number 49 now. Welcome the Cleveland Cavaliers to the mock drafts this year. We're also going to have the Timberwolves later, so that's how you know we're toward the back end of the draft and toward the back end of the process here with the second rounder. But at pick 49, the Cleveland Cavaliers select Jaime Jaquez from UCLA, and this is a really strong selection for them. Jaime Jaquez has been a part of a lot of really good collegiate basketball teams. You think back to the Final Four runs and deep postseason runs in general for the UCLA Bruins over the last couple of years. Jaime Jaquez has been in the center of that. Now, I'm not sure what his skill set really translates to in the NBA because he's been somewhat of a back-to-the-basket guard, which typically doesn't translate well. Look at Shabazz Muhammad and how he panned out in the NBA. That skill set is just not great. He doesn't have a ton of comfortability with his live handle, but the nice thing is in Cleveland, he doesn't have to worry about that as much because he's playing with Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, two guys who the offense is going to run and flow through. And off of that, it's about knocking down shots and making some plays. And those are the things I think Jaime Jaquez can do for you. And especially for kind of Cleveland situation where you're going to see a lot of wings matched up on one of kind of Mitchell or Garland, having Jaquez as a back-to-the-basket guard might be a little bit more doable because he probably gets matched up with some other guards for teams trying to hide their point guard. For example, if the Cavaliers were playing the Atlanta Hawks, Trae Young would likely try and match up on Jaquez, and that's a huge mismatch in favor of the Cavaliers in terms of trying to get him the ball around the rim. Now, they don't have a lot of spacing to offer outside of that, so we'll see if that actually ever became a productive form of offense, but I think that it's at least worth mentioning that maybe in Cleveland you can get a little bit more usage out of that because of how dynamic and quick your backcourt is currently. Pick number 50, the Oklahoma City Thunder now at this spot. And Oklahoma City, earlier on I talked about how Kobe Bufkin's still a really great pick for them, even though it doesn't address one of their biggest needs, which is rebounding. We're addressing it here with arguably the best rebounder in the draft, one of the highest motor players I've ever evaluated in Oscar Tshiebwe out of Kentucky, and a player who I think has some real shades of Kenneth Faried to his game. And I say that in a kind of gushing way, in a way that, look, this is a really solid prospect. In fact, I do believe Oscar Tshiebwe is going to have a nice career in the NBA because even though there's some concerns about, his lateral mobility, is he going to be able to guard, there's one thing that he does better than pretty much any other prospect, and that's rebounding the ball. And in the NBA, no matter what style of play it is, no matter if it's small ball, tall ball, whatever you want to talk about, the team that rebounds the ball typically wins a lot of the games. And GMs know this, executives know this. Heck, the TV broadcast talk about it literally every single night in the NBA. You have to be able to rebound to win. Oklahoma City, they lost in the final playing game because they could not keep Rudy Gobert or Karl Anthony Towns off the glass. And it's a problem if Karl Anthony Towns is destroying you on the glass because Karl Anthony Towns typically plays a little small and soft, even though he's a 7-footer. The Thunder, again, that's not a great matchup for them, but having an Oscar Tshiebwe off the bench, someone that you can sub into the game for specific situations like that, might be really beneficial for them. I don't think he would be a 20-minute per game guy, but could he play 5 impactful minutes, 10 impactful minutes when you need him to? I really believe so, and that's why I think he's worth a selection in the second round at pick number 50. Pick number 51, the Brooklyn Nets here now at this spot, and after picks at 21 and 22, they come back and take Mohamed Gay from Washington State. And Mohamed here is an interesting prospect because of his ability to knock down face-up jump shots specifically, and that's the one thing I've really noticed about him when watching is, in fact, he looks a little Joel Embiid-ish as a jump shooter. Now, I'm not saying he's Joel Embiid. He definitely is not. He's not going to score 30 points a game at any point of his career. I'd be completely shocked if that were the case. But I think he's got an intriguing face-up skill set. And I think for the Nets who are looking for, I think, more size, more rebounding capability, just more strength and kind of interior presence, this selection does make quite a bit of sense for them as a kind of, not last-ditch effort, I would say, but hey, let's bring this guy in, see if we can oversee his development, and perhaps at some point he grows into a player we could play 15 to 25 minutes a night. And I think if that pans out that way, it's a really nice player behind Nick Claxton moving forward. Moving on to pick 52, we have the Phoenix Suns on the board, which is crazy to think. And the Phoenix Suns here, I think that they like the production they got out of Josh Okogie last year. So we're going to take a player who I think has some of the similar skill sets that Okogie has, similar size, similar athletic profile, and that is Ricky Council IV from Arkansas, who I think is a really athletic, tantalizing player who likely does go in the 50s, maybe in the back end of the 40s. I could see him going a little bit higher, maybe to a team like Cleveland or the Clippers at 48 or 49, but 52 I landed on him here with Phoenix because of kind of what we've seen from them. And I think, you know, with their brand new coach, Frank Vogel, I think that they're going to be looking for a little bit more defensive intensity, guys who can defend across multiple positions, who are active. And really that's one thing that Ricky Council does well. He's a smart cutter as well. So I think playing off of Durant, Booker, and Beal, you're going to need guys who are kind of playmakers and just go out there and make stuff happen, because otherwise it's going to be a huge issue of, hey, our big three scored 90 points, but we ended up finishing with 112 points as a team and we lost by 8. There's a lot of risks to that right there, especially given the fact that, hey, DeAndre Ayton may or may not get traded. We'll see what actually happens. I think that's going to be a big question to watch for. But pick 52, the Suns, I feel really good about Ricky Council IV as a pickup for them at that spot. Moving on to pick 53, we have the Minnesota Timberwolves now on the board, or on the clock here, and they're going to be able to select a player who actually would fit in as their backup point guard on day one of his NBA career above Jordan McLaughlin, and that would be Marcus Sasser from the University of Houston. I think Sasser, a really intriguing prospect. I think people are going to first point to the shot making and shot creation elements that are obviously prevalent in his game, and I think would be really good for Minnesota off the bench behind Mike Conley. Jordan McLaughlin on any given day of the week couldn't tell you what the color of the rim is because he drives without the intention of scoring. He doesn't look at the rim very frequently, and because of that, he's not a threat at all to score, and because of that, he doesn't really create anything for your offense. Marcus Sasser, I think, with his shot making and just his ability in that regard, opens up the floor a little bit differently for Minnesota when leading the second unit. And I also think that with his activity level defensively, he does a pretty good job challenging despite kind of a small frame at only about 6'1", 6'2"-ish. He's got a 6'7" wingspan. He is active with his hands, and I think he does a decent job trying to cut guys off with his chest to the point where he can at least challenge. Now, is that going to be a consistent big plus in the NBA for him? Probably not. I think he's going to get outsized and outmatched a decent amount in the NBA. But, again, this is a backup player. This is a guy who's coming off the bench. It's not like it's a huge red flag. Most backup point guards end up giving up their fair share of points anyway. I think Marcus Sasser fits that quality pretty good for Minnesota. Moving on to pick 54, the Kings on the clock again here, and I have them going with a Dayton wing, Toumani Camara, as kind of a high upside swing on a player who has some intriguing tools. Now, I think Camara is a ways away from being a consistent contributor offensively. I think he's quite raw. I don't see him giving Sacramento a lot early on, but they have the offensive infrastructure and the style off of Sabonis to at least make a guy like Camara work potentially long-term as a backdoor cutter, somebody who I think has pretty decent instincts off the basketball. Again, this is about upside. He's got good measurables, 6'7" or so, 7 foot plus wingspan. Those are the things you're selling yourself on and trying to build some more defensive identity into your roster, especially the youth on your team. So far, we've been able to do that with Sacramento, thinking about being able to grab Jordan Walsh at 38 and coming back at 54 and taking Toumani Camara. I feel very good about the players we were able to kind of grab and address for their positional needs and kind of their overall roster construction issues, I would say. Pick 55, the Los Angeles Lakers now on the clock. This is the final pick from that Indiana Pacers trade we've referenced a bunch of times already. And at 55, the Los Angeles Lakers select Adama Sanogo from UConn, a player who I'm sure some people expected to go higher in this mock. I just couldn't find a real spot that I love for him. For Oklahoma City, I considered him, but I thought Sheboy's activity was a little bit more preferred for me. I think Sanogo, I mean, he's a good screener, was used that way a ton for UConn. And I think for the Lakers, looking at what they've been able to grab in this draft so far, Mojave King being an example, I think Max Christie from last year's draft could definitely utilize some of Sanogo's screens as an off-ball player. I think all in all, the Lakers did come out pretty good in this. Amari Bailey is a competitive guard. they drafted 4 players who I think have futures in the NBA. And because of that, I feel pretty good about the young depth that they have. I think Max Christie's going to grow into a role. I think that they'll keep Reeves and Rui. And because of that, the Lakers, they're just in a significantly better spot now than they were 12 months ago, because their roster is more well-balanced, more well laid out, and just overall deeper. And I think that goes a long way in helping your team be competitive, not just now, but for the long haul. Pick 56, we have the Memphis Grizzlies now at this spot. And the Memphis Grizzlies will select Jalen Wilson out of Kansas, who actually slid quite a ways in this mock. I think some of the teams that were looking at him just kind of needed some other spots, whether that was a backup big, maybe a backup point guard to run the show, kind of like what Minnesota ended up selecting with Marcus Sasser. I think that all in all, Jalen Wilson, he was really productive this past year for the Jayhawks, scored the ball very, very well. I think there's a future in the league for him. It's just about kind of what does that look like. He's not going to be in the same usage or utilization that he just was for the Jayhawks this past year. So I think there's going to be an adjustment period for him. And how does that exactly look? But all in all, I think that ultimately the Grizzlies here are getting pretty good value, and I think they've had a really nice, strong draft for themselves with the players they've been able to grab. Picks 57 and 58 have been forfeited. The Chicago Bulls and Philadelphia 76ers were forced to forfeit these selections due to tampering issues, which I think is a terrible thing by the NBA. The only reason I included this into the video today was because I wanted to briefly discuss the Bulls and 76ers, their situations when it comes to the forfeiture of these picks. The NBA is, for some reason, punishing 2 young players instead of 2 young prospects instead of teams. Taking away second-round picks is like a tiny little slap on the wrist that the teams barely even notice anyway. Like, do you think that the Bulls or 76ers have regrets tampering and getting the free agents that they wanted because, we had to give up picks 57 and 58 in the draft? No, they don't care. But what it does do is it hurts 2 young prospects who now do not get to hear their name called on draft night. And it's unfortunate. It's not the way that it should be handled. The fines should be steeper. There should be other negatives, whether that's kind of the removal of maybe your mid-level exception, whatever it has to be. There has to be other kind of negatives to tanking. It can't be forfeiture of picks 57 and 58 in the draft. It hurts prospects. It hurts the NBA draft itself. It's not a good look for the NBA in my opinion. And just 2 young kids end up paying the price for it. Moving on to pick number 59 now, the Washington Wizards here with this spot in the draft. Remember the last selection they went with Amani Bates, and they're going to take another upside swing here on a guy who has slid significantly down the board because of some of the frame and just overall concerns about who he is as a prospect. Terquavion Smith from NC State, a player who is razor thin at about 165 pounds. He's super light, and because of that, there's some questions about if he's an NBA level player or not, because is he going to get bullied? Is he going to be too small, too frail, too thin to really play? And I think those are some fair concerns because he is quite lengthy actually. He's not tiny. Now he's not huge either. He measured in actually decently small at the combine, but it's not like he's a 5'11 prospect. So he's wire thin. But he does have some intriguing shot making capabilities. I think for Washington, this is another upside swing for a player who people thought maybe a year ago could have been a potential first round pick. I think that a bad sophomore season at NC State where he shot really poor efficiency wise, I think that overall pick 59, it's worth the snag on him. And hopefully you find something here that he ends up popping, and if he grows into his frame a little bit, gets a bit stronger, maybe it's a huge home run pick because Washington's going to be able to give him the pathway to actually getting reps in games and kind of showcasing some of his shot making that he possesses. But all in all, I don't think Terquavion Smith's going to go a long way in moving the needle for a team like Washington who's in the beginning stages of a rebuild. Then the final pick of the draft, the Milwaukee Bucks. With pick number 60, the Milwaukee Bucks select Drew Timme from Gonzaga. I think the Bucks, they are still looking for a little bit more front court depth given Brook Lopez's age. The fact that he's a free agent, my guess is he'll be back with the organization. But I think they're looking for guys who are experienced players who can contribute on day one of their careers to their new head coach, Adrian Griffin. And Drew Timme's got a good offensive skill set. Good post-up player, has a refined post game. And yeah, Luka Garza, you think about him, he was originally with the Pistons, now is with the Timberwolves. I think they're very different players. I think Timmy's quite a bit quicker, more athletic, maybe a little bit less of a physical dominance down low as a post-up player in terms of his strength and just pure like size and shoulder width. But I think Timmy's got some of those like skills that Milwaukee could actually probably use for their half-court offense, specifically when Giannis is when Giannis is off the floor. Excuse me. I don't think Drew Timmy's gonna have like this monstrous career. I don't know. I don't think Drew Timmy's gonna be like this really good player. But I think out of remaining pieces, like, is he probably one of the more likely to find like some type of role in the NBA as like a bench scoring, like maybe third string center type? Probably, and that's kind of what I'm betting on here. 60th overall, the final pick of the draft. Thank you all so much for watching, not only this video, but throughout the year. I had so much fun covering this year's NBA draft. Remember, I'm going to be live on the channel with my 2023 NBA draft reaction live grades during the draft, plus the day before I'll be talking about the draft as well quite a bit. I'm super excited for that. I hope you guys have really enjoyed all the content. If you did, make sure to leave a like on today's video. Subscribe for more future NBA content. My big board is going to be coming out this week, so make sure you keep your eyes out for that. And just keep an eye out for all the other content. Go follow us on Twitter. Join our Discord server. Links in the description. Don't forget to sign up for that Aura 14-day free trial. It helps support the channel, by the way, so it'd be really great if you guys could help out in that regard. Thanks again so much, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.